In this tutorial today, we're going to be creating this mountain stream fluid simulation inside of Cinema 4D and Xparticles. Yo. So in this video today, I wanted to show you how to create this water simulation inside of Cinema 4D and Xparticles. We actually create this simulation using pretty simple modifiers and techniques. So if you're not necessarily used to Xparticles, this is something you could still definitely follow along with. Something I would keep in mind when following along with this tutorial is that it will require some type of high-end hardware. So I'm running a 3090 and a Ryzen 9 at the moment. It's just quite an intense scene and quite a lot of calculations for your PC. So yeah, let's jump into a new scene and get straight into it. So I've just gone ahead and imported all the assets from my current project that I've been exploring this water stream with into a new file. With this, I kind of just spent kind of half an hour developing a nice water stream foundation for this water sim to go down, including some nice complex features and a waterfall at the end, some nice rocky berms, just to get some more complex kind of water flows, I guess. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to options, materials, and turn materials off. And I'm going to go to Insidium, Xparticles, Xparticle system. Now we're not going to be using XP Nexus, which is their GPU accelerated kind of simulation calculations way, I guess you could say. It tends to be a lot faster, but I wanted this to be a universal kind of tutorial so everyone could follow along with it, in case you're not used to Nexus or you don't have Nexus. So yeah, it's just the generic CPU calculation kind of sim. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to emitters, emitter, and bring this up. So we want our waterfall to kind of be starting over here at the top of our formation. I want it to kind of come down this rock and trickle down and interact with all of these. So let's just place it up here. Let's rotate this around and make it quite a bit smaller. So it's got a kind of thin, the water has a thinner amount to come out from. Something kind of like that. Let's add a bit of rotation as well. And just make sure it's over the rocks, which it is. Cool. Let's just call this simply because we're going to be adding another emitter for various other components of this water sim. We just want to stay slightly organized. So let's jump straight into the emitter, and if we press play, we can kind of see what's happening here. I'm just going to change going to go to display and gradient parameter and just leave this for now. So we have something like this. As we can see, they're just going in a straight line, not what we want at all. So what we're going to do is we are going to go to emitter, emission. Now the emission we're going to change from rate to hexagonal. This changes the way in which the particles are spawned within the emitter. As you can kind of see, they look a bit more uniform. Now, compared to the rate and kind of all the other ones, they depend on this birth rate. When you choose hexagonal, it's all dependent on the radius. So the smaller the radius, the more particles you're going to get, because it can compact or fit more into that emitter space. And obviously, the higher you go, the less it's going to fit. So if I do like 6, you're going to see a lot less particles come out. And if I do like 2, you're going to see a lot more particles come out. I'm just going to extend this time frame to about 300 frames. And I'm going to go and change the speed. We don't want any speed. We just want gravity to affect this water and trickle it down the waterfall. So I'm just going to press 0. And the radius, I'm going to change to 1. Now, in my final sim, I did go down to 0.5 just because I wanted that extra detail, but just for the sake of the tutorial and the speed that I want to go through it, we're just going to keep it to this. So as you can see, we've got no speed and no gravity at the moment, so they're just spawning. So let's kind of move into adding a few modifiers into our sim and making this look a bit more interesting and realistic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to modifiers, motion modifiers and grab a gravity. Now in the gravity, I just kept it normal. That's kind of the realistic way in which I want it. And if we press play, we can kind of see, if I just turn this off, what's happening here. Cool. Doesn't look very water-like. It's not exactly interacting with the mountain at the moment. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go to into our assets or our 3D models, and we're going to go and select all of these. Actually, I'm just going to press Shift C and grab a connect. This will just almost like turn all of them into one mesh, so that whatever we apply to the connect object, it will apply to all of these. However, these all stay kind of individual. So if I was to grab this, turn off the connect object and grab this, they're all still individual, and this kind of just combines and merges them. So we're going to go to connect and then press Shift C and grab a XP collider, not the Cinema 4D dynamic ones, because that just won't work. So now here you can see definitely, well, a lot closer than what we had. Not exactly fluid, but it's moving down the waterfall. We have gravity affecting it, and it's interacting with our mesh. So now we need to kind of change how the particles are colliding with the mesh. At the moment, they're too bouncy. We want them to be obviously a bit slower. So I'm just going to get rid of all the bounce and put the friction on 55. I found that was kind of a nice balance. You don't want the particles almost sticking, I guess in this case to the snow or to the rocks, and I also don't want it just being way too quick. So yeah, something like this, pretty good. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go to my emitter display and change this from age to fluid density / velocity. This way we can kind of get a better indication of the speed of each particles. So for example here, they're kind of all clogged up and a bit trapped, so they're in a darker color, and the faster ones are in the brighter ones. But I'm just going to change the min to 50 and the max to 200, and that way we have a bit more variation in kind of how we see the particles. Something like this looks pretty good. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to add another modifier. So I'm just going to do Shift C and get a drag. I'm just going to put this here. This is kind of just something I like to add to my scenes to have a bit more control of how my particles or fluid sim or whatever I'm doing kind of moves through the air. Depending on what you choose here, kind of the thickness or the density of the atmosphere that or kind of what you're putting it through will change the speed and how certain particles move. So if I was to kind of shoot particles through water, they're obviously going to move a lot slower and not be as quick as if we're using something like air, which is a lot less dense, of course, than water. So we're just going to leave that with air, and you probably won't see much of a difference with that really at all. I just like to put it in there. The next thing I want to do is another modifier, and that is an xpKill. So let's just get one of those, Shift C, and then obviously just xpKill. And I'm going to put that just below here. Now I'm just going to kind of, I guess, move this box and modify this box in a way that matches the shape of this waterfall. So I'm just using the X, Z, and Y, I guess, scale points, and also just rotate it to fit this waterfall. We're just using this xpKill as a way to limit any extra resources that our computer may be doing. So let's say some particles fly off here. As soon as they leave this kind of box or boundary, they'll be killed, essentially just being taken out of the sim. That means kind of any mistakes are, I guess, taken out of the scene. So we're just gonna, in xpKill, we're just gonna keep everything the same. Actually, obviously you can change this to inside bounds. So if I was to do this, nothing would spawn because anything that is inside this box is just instantly killed and all our particles are inside. We're gonna obviously change it to outside bounds. That means anything that kind of leaves this box is going to be completely demolished in the nicest way possible. So yeah. Right, let's get into kind of making this an actual fluid looking like simulation. So I'm just going to do Shift C or go to Dynamics, choose Object, and get a xpFluidFX. Now there are a bunch of different fluid solvers, so we've got PBD and Flip. They all kind of, I wouldn't like to say specialize, but are better in different fluid looks you want, whether that's kind of you know, a chocolate pour, something a lot thicker, something like a honey pour, or something like that. However, with FluidFX, that's kind of more larger scale simulations, something like a water stream or a wave simulation in the sea, something like that. We like to use xpFluidFX. Now in the fast, in the accuracy, this is where we can change kind of how accurate or realistic the fluid sim is. So if we just keep it to fast for now, we can start to see that these particles are starting to, or are looking like a fluid sim. And as we move down this stream, we're seeing some really nice fluid formations as it works its way down. And already that is looking really nice, but obviously we want to take this to the next level in terms of detail. So in this accuracy fast, this is going to be calculating it as quick as possible, not necessarily as accurate as possible. So what we want to do is we want to change this from fast to high, and this is going to, it will slow how kind of quick the scene is being calculated, but it's going to increase the accuracy of the fluid sim itself, ultimately making it a bit more realistic. So yeah, we're starting to get somewhere now. So I've just gone ahead and let this play a bit more to calculate itself out as it moves down this stream. And something that I really wanted in this was to have a bit more control over how the fluid's moving around certain formations. Now this looks a bit pathetic as it comes down here. I kind of want it to have a bit more power around it. I want it to hit this berm and then straight into this one, then kind of fall off this waterfall, just in a bit more of a powerful fashion. This looks a bit, in my opinion, a bit pathetic. I want it to be a bit more exciting. So the way in which we're going to do that is we're going to use something called an xpFlowField. You can go to Dynamics and grab an xpFlowField. Now, xpFlowField is quite a heavy computational calculation, kind of what's going on behind the scenes. So you want to, whatever you do to these settings in the xpFlowField, you want to do carefully, as you can run into some issues. So I'm just going to place, just like we did with the kill modifier box, I'm just going to place this in the kind of correct position without using up too much space. Now, what the flow field does is that whatever you apply into these kind of layers, it will move the particles in certain ways that aren't necessarily natural or realistic, but definitely adds a more artistic, creative approach. So at the moment, they're just displayed as these kind of weird squiggly lines or splines. So I'm going to go to display, change it from trail to arrow. And this way we can kind of see the direction the particles are moving in. And the mode, instead of XY plane, so it's just kind of this 2D representation, I'm going to change it to voxels. And at the moment, they're just kind of all over the place, and that's because in the layers, we've got it just set to random. Now, because we want kind of this ultimate control of the direction it's going in, I've just gone ahead and drawn a spline. Now, this is something you can do really quick and easy, but just for the sake of the tutorial, I've gone ahead and developed, just quickly made this spline here. Something super simple, but as you can see, I've kind of drawn it out in a way that it will get these particles over here, hit it harsher into this berm, and then also hit it harsher and bring the particles more this way so it hits into this berm as well, and then kind of drags off in a bit more of a powerful fashion over the waterfall. And then you can just go ahead and if you want the particles to move more in a certain direction or less, you can. So if I wanted the particles to move way more this way and way more kind of powerful, I'll just move it further, or increase the flow field power, of course. So let's just jump straight into the XP flow field settings. So we're going to change this XP flow field layers from random to a long spline. So let's just grab that, and we've obviously just made our spline that we want our particles to follow. So let's grab our flow field and drag it into the objects. Now, let's just jump. There's only a few settings we need to change here to get the look that we want. One of them being the strength. So this is how much you want the particles to interact with the direction the spline is going. I had mine originally at 15. However, 10 may also be good as well if you want a bit more, if you want to lean a bit more to the realistic side, I guess you could say. And the next one I wanted to change was 25 in the cell size. Now, the cell size is kind of the amount of, well, essentially arrows or directional point information it's going to be adding to the particles. So if I was to have this on, let's say 80, as you can see, if I go to display and transparency down, it doesn't have much information and directional information for the kind of particles to go off, as you can kind of see here. However, if we go back and change the cell size to 30, you can see how many more arrows or directional kind of information it has to develop, I guess, directional information. So yeah, just change this depending on the look you want to go for. Obviously, the more detail in which you want your particles to move, the smaller the cell size it should be. And the less detail or the less accurate you want that flow field to be interacting with your particles, the higher the cell size should be. So I'm just going to change this to 25 like I had in my original one. And that's pretty much it. I think in the strength I had this, no, I had that on 50. And yeah, I just kept everything else pretty much the same. You can alter the fall off. So kind of, as you can see here, the angle at which the arrows are facing with the spline are a lot more intense. And as it gets further out of the flow field box, these arrows are moving at less of a harsh angle. So it's having a nice fall off effect. What I wanted to move on to now was the actual detail of the fluid sim. Now, as you can see here, yes, we have 43,000 particles, which in some simulations is quite a lot, but in a more large fluid simulation, we want to add a bit more detail. As you can see here, we have quite a bit of separation between these particles. So when it comes to meshing, it's not going to look the greatest. And isn't going to be the most realistic. It's going to be a bit blobby and things like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to use another dynamic, and that is the xpSheeter. Now the xpSheeter basically looks at the distance between particles and adds more particles depending on if the distance is too great between them. So obviously the issue we have at the moment is the lack of detail due to kind of the amount of particles we have. And what the xpSheeter does is that it looks at a certain amount of particles and goes, right, we don't have enough particles in this area to have this amount of detail, let's add some more, so to kind of, I guess, fill in the gaps. So something like around here, it's going to add a few more particles around there to increase the density of the particle sim. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the max density to 83, So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to take relative speed and put that on to 45 and bring this down to 250. The velocity alignment angle can just stay the same. And yeah, I also want to go back and change this from fast to high. So now what you'll kind of see is these particles starting to get filled in and we're getting a bit more detail. However, the sim does run a lot slower. That is because there are a lot more calculations going on now that we have this sheeter. So as you can see, it's considerably slower, but you can see how many particles we now have. Now, arguably, yes, we have way too many and it's starting to look kind of a bit thick. And not the greatest. We're also getting some kind of a lot of particles at the back, which is obviously wasting quite a bit of what our computer is calculating. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change a few more settings here. The min hole size staying as 0, the max hole size I want to bring down to 4, and the max speed I want to change to 1000. And let's see what kind of the look from this now is. Way better. So we're getting less of this, I guess, bulging at the back of the fluid, which makes it look a lot more viscous. And it's now looking at the particles and filling them in a bit more. So let's just do a kind of a before and after. If I turn the sheeter off, and if we turn the sheeter on, specifically, you'll start to see it around this area. Yeah, that looks a lot better. And obviously it's now spawning way more particles, and it's looking a bit more interesting. So before we move on to kind of the next part and making the simulation a bit more interesting, what I wanted to go over is also the accuracy of the simulation. So what I did as well is I've made the emitter slightly smaller, so it's a bit more thinner and covers less of this kind of top bit. What I've also done is I've gone to mode project Xparticles. Now, if I press play here, what you can see here is almost, there's like too much happening, especially with the settings that we've applied, and it's not necessarily too accurate. So what I did in my previous one is I increased the subframe steps and the iterations of the scene. So I changed the subframe steps from 1 to 3, and the iterations from 2 to 4. Now what you'll see now is honestly a bit more realistic, a bit more almost tendril-like, and definitely more water-like. It just looks a lot better. However, everything also looks a bit thinner, but was definitely more of the look I was going for. Not only that, the simulation is also a lot slower, and the velocity isn't quite as extreme. The next thing I want to do is I want to add an XP cache. Just do Shift-C and look up XP cache. Now here I chose internal memory instead of external. Both have their pros and cons. Internal memory will save all the calculations and all the particles to your Cinema 4D scene file, and external files will save it to disk. It should take about, I'm going to say 5 minutes for the 100 frames. So yeah, I'll be back once that has fully cached. So this is fully cached. It actually did it in about 1 minute 30 seconds. So now we have a really nice fluid sim. I only did 100 frames, and it took about 1 minute 30 seconds. And yeah, we're most of the way there. I mean, we've got the look down. It's now just about adding some extra more kind of realistic parts and meshing it, and also diving into Vertex maps and things like that. So obviously, when water is moving quite quickly, we get bubbles, we get foam, we get something called white water. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Dynamics, click the drop down, and get xpFoam. Now, xpFoam needs its own emitter because obviously it's going to be spawning and emitting its own foam particles on the surface of this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to add emitter, and it's just added it here, and we're going to do _foam. Perfect. Now there's a few settings I want to change here, and that is going to be the after age being 5, the life being 150, so how long those foam particles are going to be alive for. Radius is going to stay at 10. The min speed I want to take down to 45. The min crest I want to take down to 3. The impact I want to do 35. The air rate I'm going to go to 0. The variation at 1, 10, 50. The max speed I want to take to 155. The max crest I want to take to 85, and the max impact I want to stay at 70. The buoyancy I want to change to, where's that gone? Just deleted it by accident. Anyway, the buoyancy I want to change to 0.05. Spray at 40, foam density at 30. And spray density at 10. Perfect. That should be everything we need for the xpFoam. The next thing I want to do is I want to go to the foam emitter. I want to go to display and change these from squares to dots, just so they're a bit smaller. Now, obviously, depending on the look and depending on the amount of particles you want spawned for that white water or that foam, you're gonna have to change some of these, specifically the crest rate and the air rate, and also the min and max impact and speeds. That will all depend on how many particles are spawned, depending on obviously how the fluid is ultimately moving or interacting with the mesh. So yeah, let's just turn off this cache and see what happens. So this is uncached now. This is doing it on the fly. And as we can see here, we've got some really nice foam particles spawning and creating some, and it's just floating on the surface, which is exactly what we want. We don't want it in the water, almost like bubbles. We want it like foam sitting on the top, almost like what you see in kind of the sea, something like that. So yeah, as we can see here, we've got some really nice foam and white water forming in the areas that we would see it in the real world. Really nice, kind of following it down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cache this again, and we can see what it looks like in real time. That only took about 2 minutes to cache. Obviously there's quite a lot more particles now, but we're still doing it really quickly. It looks really nice now, especially all of this kind of coming down here and interacting with kind of the rocks. And yeah, I'm really liking how this is looking. So the next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be meshing these particles so we can actually start seeing what it look like in the final render. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to generators, choose generator, and get an open VDB mesher. So the first thing I want to do is I want to drag this water into the mesh, or the mesh kind of choice. Right, so that has done it pretty well. I mean, it's way too thick, it's way too blobby, and if we look at the wireframe mode, it is just not detailed enough to start seeing these nice swirls and these nice interactions with the rocks that we want. So actually, let's just stay in the lines mode for the moment. What I want to do is I want to change the point radius from 10 to 3. Now that pretty much has made the particles disappear. That's due to the voxel size being bigger than the point radius. So if you want your point radius to be really low, then you need your voxel size to be matching that, or to be lower as well. So I'm just going to do 2. Just keep going until it's kind of there. So now we can kind of see way more resolution. Obviously the mesh is a lot more dense here due to that voxel size, which is basically telling OpenVDB Mesher how dense we want, or how much resolution we want our mesh. So if we were to go even lower to 0.75, we get even more density. Now this definitely becomes more intensive on your machine. Obviously it's got to change and manipulate this for each frame, so do be careful about going too low, as it can get a bit risky. For now I'm just going to keep it at 0.75, and the point radius I'm going to change to 2. Now the point radius is essentially how big each particle essentially is. So each particle has almost like a ball around it, and what the mesher does is it kind of looks at each of those balls and kind of merges them together to form essentially a nice fluid mesh. We can kind of start to see that up here. You can almost see like these ball formations, maybe even more in without the lines. See kind of how it's looking quite blobby, definitely up here. So essentially that point radius is how big each of those are. So possibly the higher you go, the less amount of that you're going to get, but obviously you're then going to lack detail. That is when we come to the next part of the OpenVDB Mesher, which is the filters, which how we're going to start making this fluid mesh look a lot more smooth and a lot more visually appealing. So I'm just going to press use filters, and I believe I actually just used the median in this one. Obviously there are a lot more you can use and choose from here. For example, the Gaussian one, that's quite intense, and here we're now kind of seeing a very, very smooth mesh, almost thicker, almost like paint, you could say, but I wanted to keep some of that intricate detail that we were getting in the mesh, and I didn't want this really harsh smoothing, so I just got rid of the Gaussian one and kept the medium one. You can start to see kind of the difference. So before and after looks a lot nicer and gets rid of some like horrible jagged endings of the mesh. The next thing I did was I brought in a smoothing modifier inside of Cinema 4D. This is not kind of Xparticles doing this. So what I want to do is I just want to do that and click shift, and the smoothing deformer, I should say, is applied to the mesher, as we can kind of see here. That is essentially the Gaussian one that we did, but let's just lower the strength, say 40 iterations to just keep that at 10. Maybe lower this even more, actually 25. So yeah, looking even nicer now. I'm actually going to lower that maybe even a bit more. This is obviously getting really down to the detail, but I didn't want it looking too rough. Like you can see here, it's a bit rough, and now it's a lot smoother, and we're still keeping some of the nice details in here, and also up here. So if we press play now, it's still super quick. Now the particles, yes, they're cached, but the mesh isn't. The mesh is being calculated and is showing it in real time as well. That's looking really, really nice. And yeah, I mean, now we have a really, you could essentially go ahead and render this, and you'd start seeing this. But I want to move even further into what Xparticles has to offer, and start talking about Vertex and wet maps. So let's bring in a Xparticles Vertex map. And we can just do that by Shift C and bringing in a vertex map and dropping that into modifiers. Now, the thing with vertex maps in Xparticles is because we're going to be dealing with obviously animated meshes or particles, it's going to be quite intensive on it. That is the case usually with vertex maps if it's very detailed meshes or if you have kind of very detailed interactions with those vertex maps. Originally, I was exploring with kind of what we could do if it was interacting with particles instead of meshes and things like that. But I'm now going to show you what I eventually decided to use when doing this. So the thing I want to do is I want to click on vertex map and drag in the connect. So this is basically telling Xparticles I want a vertex map to be applied to this mesh, our connect object being this Arctic formation. And as you can see now, it's put a vertex map across the whole of our mesh. Great. We're halfway there essentially now. So what we're going to use for basically telling this vertex map what part we want to be yellow and what part we want to be red, we need to add something into this object section. Now, obviously, this mesh that we have is super dense. Like it's really quite high poly, and if we're going to be using that in our vertex map, it's going to be super slow and super sluggish. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this, and we'll call this one _vertex map. And I'm going to turn this off for a sec. And then in this, as we were talking about the voxel size and the point radius, we want it to be lower resolution so it's easier for our vertex map to handle. Basically, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be telling our vertex map modifier to look at where this mesh is interacting with our Arctic formation and essentially tell it to, well, in the vertex map case, to turn yellow in our case. So let's change this from 0.75 to 1.5 and the point radius to 3. As you can see, it's a lot less dense now. Arguably still too dense. So 2 and 4, that should be okay. Let's see if we can go even higher to maybe that's a bit too much. 3 and 6. So we have that coverage that the other one is still covering, but we have a lot less polygons for this vertex map to calculate. So we're just going to drag this OpenVD Mesher vertex map into this vertex map here, and just drop it into objects. Now, if we click on our vertex map and we are staying in the lines mode so we can see it a bit better, you'll start to see what it's doing. And as you can see, as the mesh is slowly making its way down, the mesh is slowly turning yellow, or our vertex map is turning yellow. But obviously, if this water is going to be interacting with snow, this might be a bit too extreme and it's spreading out a bit too far. We'd only be getting kind of the melting of the snow, just maybe slightly around it. So we're going to change a few settings inside of our vertex map. So what I want to do is I want to go to range and change this considerably lower. So maybe something like 5. What the range is kind of that distance from where the mesh is interacting with the other mesh, and kind of spreading or smoothing that yellowness of the vertex map. So as you can see, if I click on it, see how it's now not spreading as much. So let me just do it before and after. This is obviously with the lower range, and this is with the higher range. kind of 5, maybe 10 being a lot more accurate. So let's just go right in the middle and do maybe like 7. Something like that maybe is good. In my final one, I did use 5, as I thought that that's kind of where the snow would be melting or interacting. The next thing I want to do is I want to change this range fall off. So I just grabbed it here. Let me just move here so it's not calculating in real time. I just dragged this up here, and now we're getting a slightly different look again. But yeah, that is essentially the vertex map. I think the only other thing I did was I went to effects, smoothing, I put to 1, and I changed it to about 50%. Yeah. And then what you can do is you can hide this one in the viewport and enable this one again. So this one we're not going to be seeing in our viewport. However, it is being calculated as we need it to be calculated due to it being used in this vertex map. However, we want to be seeing kind of the high resolution one. So we're going to keep this kind of showing. If we go back here, if we go to lines again, this is now a high resolution mesh, but our vertex map mesher is going to be kind of carrying the vertex map simulation. So the next thing I want to do is I want to cache this simulation so we can start seeing it forming and trickling down this mountain, and also start interacting with this flow field that we were doing previously, and we can start seeing kind of the particles move around that area in the way that we modified them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do xp cache, and this time I am going to do xparticles external files, just due to it being, we're going to be caching a lot more. It's going to end up being quite a big file size, probably a couple gigs. I'm not going to be caching, however, the meshes, as we can just do that in real time. So yeah, I'll be back with this full 400 frames, which should be enough for this whole thing to start moving down and ultimately falling off this waterfall. So my scene has finished caching. Now, due to the long caching times and this being quite a complex simulation, I did turn off the foam just for the purpose of this tutorial, as well as I increased the radius of each particle, meaning there's less to calculate. So this took about 13 minutes for 400 frames, as we can see here. Now, the bit I really wanted to hone in on was this part that we focused on when we were developing the flow field. So originally it was kind of coming down here and almost just trickling down this middle bit and across here. But now we have kind of this water interacting more with this berm that I imported from Quixel. I just like the aesthetic of it a bit more. It's not necessarily more realistic, but more just artistic, I guess you could say. So that here you can kind of see that flow field taking effect on the particles as it kind of brings it round here, which we can also see from the arrow indications. So essentially this is the end of the tutorial. So in this tutorial we have developed a really nice fluid simulation of like an Arctic waterfall, using various techniques. One thing I just want to lastly touch on is this vertex map can be used in your renderer to basically create a wet map. So you can essentially, if I bring up one of the materials I developed here, so here we have the material that I developed, that when this fluid interacts with the snow, it changes color, which is essentially what happens in the real world. It's going to melt some of the snow under it. So what I've done here is I've got these aren't loaded in. I've got the textures, both going into a different color correction. I've got one which is just normal, brightness on 1, and I've got another one with the brightness on 0.4. I've then got this plugged into a mixed texture, and then the amount is being controlled by the Vertex map. The Vertex map being the one that we created using xpVertexMap and the lower resolution VDB mesher. So this is what you can use that really useful Vertex map for, and that's when creating wet maps or interactions with the fluid in your renderer. I might do another part where we go over the rendering of this scene, including the materials, the wet map development, and the lighting. So let me know down below if you are interested in another video regarding all of that, and I'd be happy to do another one. Just remember that all of these files are uploaded onto my Patreon, and you can find a link in the description below. If you have any questions or concerns or need kind of any help regarding this tutorial or the project files, just contact me on Twitter or comment below on this video,